Rain came down in relentless sheets against the floor-to-ceiling glass, a steady, drumming percussion that swallowed the city lights into a smear of gold and gray far below. Somewhere out past the skyline, thunder rolled low and distant, like something ancient turning over in its sleep, restless and patient at once. Inside the penthouse, the air was warm and still, thick with the particular hush of old money, cut only by the low, indulgent hum of jazz drifting from hidden speakers tucked into the walls, brass and piano, unbothered by the storm raging just beyond the glass, as if the weather itself had been instructed not to intrude on whatever was about to happen in this room tonight. Don Alessandro Rossi moved across the hardwood floor with the unhurried rhythm of a man who owned every square inch of it, and every square inch of several dozen buildings besides, scattered across 3 continents, each one a small monument to how far he had climbed from where he had started. His shoes struck the polished wood in even, deliberate beats, footsteps that carried the weight of certainty rather than urgency. He paused near the window, studied the storm for a long moment as though it were a minor inconvenience arranged specifically for his benefit, then resumed his pacing, hands clasped loosely behind his back. He was not a man who rushed. He was a man who arrived exactly when he intended to arrive, and stayed exactly as long as he pleased, and tonight, he intended to enjoy himself thoroughly. He had been waiting for this particular evening for the better part of a year, ever since the first reports crossed his desk about a once proud family drowning quietly in debt they could never hope to repay. He remembered reading the initial file with something close to indifference, and then, slowly, with a gathering interest that had only sharpened with each passing month. Patience, in his experience, was simply cruelty stretched out long enough to taste better when it finally arrived. The heavy double doors at the far end of the room groaned as they were forced open, iron hinges protesting under the strain of years and neglect and the deliberate weight of 2 men leaning into them together. The guards entered first, their footsteps solid and unhesitating on the marble of the entryway, flanking a third, smaller set of footsteps that shuffled and stumbled between them, unsteady, reluctant, dragged forward by momentum rather than any remaining will of her own. They pushed her into the room without ceremony, without so much as a word of introduction, as though she were cargo rather than a guest, which, in the calculus of the evening as Alessandro understood it, was precisely what she was meant to be. Her clothes clung to her, heavy and saturated with rainwater, and each hesitant step she took left a soft, wet imprint on the immaculate floor, small dark islands blooming and slowly fading behind her. Her breath came in tight, uneven gasps, the unmistakable sound of someone who had been out in the storm far too long, cold to the bone and cornered on every side, a woman who understood, with each passing second, exactly how few options remained available to her. One of the guards, a broad-shouldered man Alessandro paid handsomely precisely because he asked no questions, glanced toward his employer for confirmation before releasing her arm, as though some part of him understood, on an animal level, that letting go of her felt like releasing something far more dangerous than a frightened, soaked woman half his size. Alessandro gave the smallest nod, barely a movement at all, and the guard's grip loosened at once. "That's enough," Alessandro said, and he did not raise his voice to say it. He never needed to. The command in his tone carried its own gravity, settling over the room like a hand pressed flat against it, and both guards retreated immediately, their boots receding down the marble hallway at a pace just quick enough to betray their relief at being allowed to leave. The heavy doors swung shut behind them with a resounding thud that seemed to shake dust from the crown molding high above, and the lock turned over with a sharp, final click that landed in the room like the closing note of a much longer, much darker piece of music. For a moment, Alessandro simply savored the fact of their solitude, the particular, private pleasure of an empty room and a closed door and no one left anywhere in the building who might interrupt whatever he decided to do next. He had built his entire life around exactly this kind of moment, the instant after every witness had been cleared from the room, when the only rules left standing were the ones he chose to enforce. It occurred to him, distantly, that he had not asked her name yet, not directly, not in a way that required her to answer him aloud. He had read it in a file. He had heard it spoken by the men who delivered her. It had never once occurred to him that hearing it from her own mouth might matter, and even now, watching her stand dripping and silent in the center of his floor, he told himself it still didn't. Names were for equals. Whatever she was to him tonight, equal was not a word he had any intention of applying to it. "You may speak, if you like," he said, almost generously, crossing back toward the sideboard to refill his glass though it was still half full. "I find silence loses its charm rather quickly once the room has emptied. Tell me your name, if it pleases you." "I already know it, of course, but I find people generally prefer being asked." She did not answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice came out exactly as thin and frightened as everything that had come before it. "Elena," she said. Only that. Nothing more offered, nothing more taken, and if he noticed how carefully measured even her fear seemed to be, he mistook it, in that moment, for nothing more than exhaustion. Silence settled between them then, or as close to silence as the storm and the low murmur of jazz would allow. Alessandro let it stretch, unhurried, watching her shiver in the low light. He had learned long ago that silence, properly wielded, frightened people far more effectively than shouting ever could, and he had every intention of wielding it now, at his leisure, for as long as it amused him to do so. He crossed to the sideboard without so much as a glance in her direction, lifting a crystal decanter and pouring 2 careful fingers of amber liquid over a bed of ice. The clink of the cubes against the glass was almost pleasant, almost civilized, entirely and deliberately at odds with what he said next, his back still turned, his tone conversational, as though he were commenting on nothing more consequential than the weather outside the window. "Your father," he began, "borrowed $4 million from my organization 11 years ago. $4 million, for a shipping venture that collapsed within 18 months, taking half his remaining fortune down with it, and taking his reputation down not long after." He took a slow, unhurried sip, savoring it, letting the number hang in the air a moment before continuing, as though giving her time to fully absorb its weight. "With interest, and my patience, Miss Vance, has never come cheap, not for anyone. That number now sits somewhere north of $11 million. Your brother tried to run from that debt 8 months ago. We found him in Marseille, in a rented room above a fish market, 3 days before he meant to disappear onto a freighter bound for nowhere in particular. He cried, if you're curious. Begged, even. It didn't move me nearly as much as he hoped it would. He let that land before continuing, watching her carefully now, cataloging every flicker across her face. Your mother tried to bargain instead, which I respected marginally more, though it accomplished exactly as much in the end. She offered me the house first. Then the jewelry. Then, when she ran out of things to offer, she offered excuses, which interested me even less than the jewelry had. My father is a good man, Elena said, or rather, the woman he believed to be Elena Vance said it, her voice thin and shaking, exactly as he expected it to be. He made mistakes. He never meant for any of us to suffer for them. Good men rarely borrow $4 million from organizations like mine, Alessandro said, not unkindly, in the tone of a teacher correcting a student he had already decided not to fail. In my experience, good men borrow considerably less, and only ever from banks. It's the desperate ones who come to me. Desperation has a particular scent to it, Miss Vance, and your father reeked of it the first time he sat across from me. He was trying to save his company. To save all of our futures. He was trying to save his pride, Alessandro corrected, which is a far more expensive thing to rescue than any company, and considerably less likely to survive the attempt. He studied her a moment, something almost curious entering his expression. Tell me. Did he ever explain to you exactly what he offered as collateral, in the event he couldn't repay what he owed? I've always wondered whether men in his position tell their daughters the truth, or simply let them find out the hard way, the way you're finding out now. She said nothing, and he took her silence as confirmation of precisely what he'd suspected. He never told you, Alessandro said. How disappointing. And yet here you are anyway, delivered exactly on schedule, as though the debt collected itself. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile at that, one she would remember, later, with considerably less patience than she managed to summon in the moment. He turned at last, finally allowing himself to look at her fully, taking his time over the inventory, the soaked hair plastered to her cheek, the trembling shoulders, the wide, glassy eyes of a cornered animal caught somewhere between fight and collapse. He found the sight, he had to admit, rather satisfying, the kind of satisfaction he rarely bothered denying himself anymore. And now, he said, there's only you. The last currency your family has left to offer, and I have decided, after some consideration, that you'll do quite nicely in place of $11 million I was never going to see returned regardless. Elena said nothing in response. Her breathing remained shallow, ragged, and uneven, the unmistakable rhythm of pure, unfiltered terror. She stood dripping in the center of the vast room, arms wrapped loosely around herself, shoulders drawn inward, looking every inch the woman who had, at long last, run entirely out of road, out of options, out of anyone left in the world willing or able to save her. Beneath that trembling surface, in a place he could not see and would never be permitted to see, something else entirely was happening. She counted his footsteps without meaning to, an old habit worn smooth by years of practice, the same way she had once counted the seconds between her mother's sobs through a thin apartment wall, the same way she had counted the months it took to trace a single shell company back through 11 jurisdictions to a name that finally meant something. She let her shoulders curl inward a fraction further. She let her breath catch exactly where a frightened woman's breath would catch. Every tremor in her hands had been rehearsed 100 times in front of a mirror in a rented room 3,000 miles from here, until she could no longer tell, herself, where the performance ended and the woman underneath it began, except that tonight, for the first time in 10 years, she remembered precisely where that line was, and precisely how much longer she intended to stand on the wrong side of it. She had imagined this room 1,000 different ways. She had never imagined jazz. Alessandro set his glass down on the desk with a sharp, deliberate crack of crystal against polished wood, and began walking toward her, slow and unhurried, savoring the shrinking distance between them the way another man might savor the last course of an excellent meal, unwilling to rush the pleasure of it. Each step of his shoes against the hardwood landed like a small verdict being handed down. The debt comes due tonight, he said, his voice dropping lower with every word, losing its earlier lightness and taking on something far more deliberate, more possessive. There is no extension. No negotiation. No clever lawyer waiting in some office downtown to draft a payment plan that buys you another 6 months of pretending this can be solved with money you don't have and never will. He stopped, close enough now that she would surely feel the warmth radiating off him, close enough that the scent of expensive cologne and older whiskey reached her fully, inescapably. You understand that, don't you? There is no door out of this room tonight that leads anywhere except through me. She let her eyes drop to the floor, shoulders curling further inward, the posture of a woman doing everything in her power to make herself smaller, less visible, less present in a room that had already decided what to do with her. You said my mother offered you the house, she said, her voice trembling. Where is she now? Is she alive? Alessandro said, almost bored by the question. For now. I have no particular interest in harming a woman who no longer has anything I want. She's staying in one of my properties outside the city, comfortable enough, though I imagine she isn't sleeping well. Mothers rarely do, in situations like hers. Whether she continues staying there comfortably rather depends on how tonight goes. I'd think carefully about that, if I were you. Please, she said, and the word came out cracked, barely audible over the storm, exactly as fragile as he expected a word like that to sound from a woman in her position. There has to be another way. I'll do anything. Just not. There is nothing else you have that interests me, he said, cutting her off without raising his voice, without needing to. You would be surprised how rarely anyone offers me anything worth considering twice. Money bores me. I have more of it than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. Threats bore me even more. I've heard every version of them from men far more dangerous than your father ever was, and they're all sleeping in the same 6 feet of ground now. He studied her a moment longer, tilting his head slightly, the way a man might study a painting he was already certain he intended to purchase. But you're new. And I find that I have grown rather tired, lately, of things that aren't. He reached out slowly, deliberately, and let his voice drop into something darker, quieter, almost unbearably intimate as it settled against her ear, each word measured and unhurried. You're mine tonight. Fabric rustled softly as he reached out and caught her chin between 2 fingers, tilting her face upward toward his, claiming the moment the way he had claimed nearly everything else in his life, simply by deciding, without hesitation or doubt, that it belonged to him and always would. And then, nothing. Her breathing, which had trembled and hitched unevenly for the better part of the last 10 minutes, simply stopped. A beat of dead, total silence swallowed the room whole, so complete that even the storm outside seemed to fall away for a moment, distant and unimportant, background noise to something far more immediate. The jazz, which had murmured faithfully on in the background all evening, seemed to falter along with it, the melody dissolving into a soft, unnatural hush, as though the entire penthouse itself had drawn in a breath and was now holding it, waiting, along with him, to see what would happen next. Then she moved. It was not the flinch of a frightened woman recoiling from an unwanted touch. It was a single, fluid step backward, clean and economical and utterly precise, slipping free of his grip the way water finds the fastest possible route out of a closed hand, leaving nothing behind for him to hold on to. When she came to rest again, several careful feet away, something in her entire bearing had changed completely, as though a switch somewhere deep inside her had simply been thrown. The trembling was gone, vanished as though it had never existed at all. In its place stood something rigid, coiled, and perfectly still, the unmistakable posture of a woman who had never once, during this entire encounter, actually been afraid of him, not for a single second. Alessandro felt something shift in his own chest, a small, unfamiliar prickle of unease he did not care to examine too closely. In 20 years of running men and money and the occasional necessary funeral, he had learned to read a room within seconds of entering it, and every instinct he had cultivated over those 20 years was now telling him, quietly but insistently, that he had misread this one from the very beginning. He dismissed the thought as quickly as it arrived. Old habits, he told himself. Nothing more. Careful, he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty, a fraction of its polish worn away by the sudden, unfamiliar sensation of not being entirely sure what happened next. In 20 years, no one still breathing had ever managed to make him feel that particular sensation twice in the same room, let alone within the same conversation, and he found he did not much care for the discovery that it could still happen to him at all. You should be, Elena replied. The jazz still murmured faintly from the walls, and outside the storm had not relented in the slightest, thunder rolling closer now, near enough that the glass shivered faintly in its frame with each low peal. Neither of them looked toward the window. Whatever was happening in this room had become, in the space of a single heartbeat, far more urgent than any storm the sky could produce. His hand moved on pure instinct at that, the leather of his shoulder holster scraping faintly as his palm settled, automatic and practiced, against the grip of the weapon beneath his jacket. He watched, wary now, every muscle drawn tight, as her own hand slid into the folds of her soaked trench coat, and his whole body went taut and ready, every year of training in his blood rising instantly to the surface, prepared for whatever came next. She didn't draw a gun. What she produced instead was a thick, heavy manila envelope, its edges swollen with rainwater, sealed shut with a dark, careful smear of wax pressed at the fold. She crossed the distance to his desk without hesitation, without so much as a flicker of doubt crossing her face, and let it fall from her hand. It landed with a flat, definitive smack against the mahogany surface, a sound that seemed, somehow, far louder than it had any right to be, the sound, he would later think, of a door closing somewhere far more important than the one behind him. "Open it," she said. It was the first time she had spoken all evening, and the sound of her voice bore no resemblance whatsoever to the frightened, gasping breath he had listened to only moments before. It was smooth, unhurried, aristocratic in a way that raised the hair along the back of his neck, chillingly calm, the voice of someone who had never once, in her entire life, been told no and been made to believe it. "You're in no position to give me instructions," Alessandro said, though even as the words left him, he found himself reaching for the envelope anyway, some quiet, unfamiliar instinct overriding 20 years of never once letting anyone else dictate the pace of a room he occupied. "I gave up worrying about my position the moment I walked through those doors," she said. "I'd have thought a man in your line of work would recognize confidence when it's standing directly in front of him. Or has it simply been so long since anyone dared show you any that you've forgotten what it looks like?" Something flickered behind his eyes at that, not quite anger, not quite admiration, some uncomfortable third thing he had no ready name for. "Open it," she said again, softer this time, almost gentle, the way one might speak to a man standing at the edge of something he could not yet see the bottom of. Alessandro scoffed, a short, dismissive exhale meant to reassert the room, and the evening, and the entire balance of power as his own, but the breath that followed it betrayed him just slightly, a fraction too quick, a fraction too sharp, catching in his throat in a way he would have punished in anyone else who worked for him. He reached for the envelope anyway, because a man built the way he was built could never resist a challenge laid so plainly, so calmly, at his feet, not even when some quiet instinct warned him that he should. The wax seal cracked apart beneath the pressure of his thumb with a sharp, brittle snap. Thick paper tore as he ripped the envelope open along its fold, the sound unnaturally loud in the hush that had settled over the room, louder even than the storm still battering itself uselessly against the windows, louder than the low thud of his own pulse, which had begun, for the first time all night, to climb towards something he did not yet care to name. Papers slid free of the envelope and rustled loosely in his hands. The first was a single printed sheet, a DNA analysis, dense columns of genetic markers and percentages that meant nothing to him at a glance, except for the single name typed in bold letters across the header. He read it once. Then again, more slowly, as though the second reading might somehow correct the first and return the evening to the shape he had planned for it. His lips moved without his permission, forming her surname under his breath, confusion bleeding steadily into every syllable. "Vance isn't your name," he murmured, more to himself than to her, flipping the page back over as though the reverse side might offer some explanation he could accept. "This says." "Finish it," Elena said quietly, and there was something almost gentle in the way she said it, the gentleness of someone delivering a verdict they had waited years, patiently, to pronounce aloud. He didn't finish it. He couldn't. So she finished it for him, and when the name left her mouth, it was not Vance at all, but the surname of a family he had been raised, from earliest childhood, to believe no longer existed anywhere on this earth, a capo bloodline his own father had sworn, decades ago, had been wiped out entirely, root and branch, in a single terrible night that had passed, over the years, into something close to syndicate legend. "That's not possible," he said, and for the first time that evening, there was something almost pleading in his voice, a crack he would never have permitted in front of anyone else in his organization. "That family died out 30 years ago. Everyone knows that. My father." He stopped himself before he could finish the sentence, some instinct warning him that whatever came next would not be a defense but a confession he wasn't yet ready to make, even silently, even to himself. He thought, unwillingly, of 100 small moments scattered across his childhood that had never quite added up, the way certain older men in the organization went quiet whenever the founding years came up at dinner, the way his father's expression had once flickered, briefly and unreadably, when a rival family's crest was mentioned in passing at a wedding neither of them had wanted to attend. He had never once thought to assemble those moments into a shape. He was beginning, now, against his will, to understand why someone might have wanted to make certain he never did. "Keep reading," Elena said. "You'll understand exactly what your father knows in a moment." Alessandro's hands were no longer quite so steady as he turned to the next page. It was old, the paper gone brittle and yellowed at the edges, the ink faded to a rust brown that might once have been simple black, or might, he realized with a slow, crawling dread spreading up through his chest, have always been something else entirely. A blood oath. A century old, the wax at its bottom cracked with age, the signatures faded but unmistakably legible, names he recognized from portraits that had hung in his father's study for as long as he could remember. He read it aloud, haltingly, and for the first time all evening, his voice shook, each word costing him something it had never cost him before in his life. "This is a founding charter," he said slowly, turning the brittle page over as though the back of it might contradict the front. 5 families. 5 signatures. My great-grandfather's name is here. So is," he stopped. His finger hovered above a second name, one he had seen 1,000 times before in old photographs, in the leather-bound ledgers his father kept locked in a study he was rarely permitted to enter as a boy. "So is mine," Elena said, finishing the thought for him a second time. "My family didn't simply do business with yours, Alessandro. We built this organization together, side by side, in equal measure, 100 years ago. 2 founding houses. 2 equal shares of everything your father has spent his entire life pretending was his alone to inherit." "If that were true," he said, though the protest came out weaker than he intended, "someone would have told me." "Someone would have." "Someone did tell you," she said. "Every year, on the anniversary, your father visits a grave outside the city and leaves flowers on it. You've asked him twice, as a boy, whose grave it was. He told you it was an old business partner. He wasn't lying, exactly. He was simply choosing which half of the truth to give you." The pieces fell into place with sickening, vertiginous speed, one after another, faster than he could brace for any of them. The Vance debt, the $4 million, the 11 years of compounding interest, the entire elaborate fiction he had built this whole evening around, had never existed at all. It was scaffolding, nothing more, constructed with patient, meticulous care for one single purpose, to walk her, willingly and unremarked, straight through his front door and into this room, into this exact moment. "Every number I gave you tonight," he said slowly, "every file, every report." "Fabricated," Elena confirmed. "Beautifully, I think. It took my people almost a year to build a deck convincing enough that you'd never once think to question it. You didn't. Not for a second." He reached the final document last, and it was this one that took the floor out from beneath him entirely, more thoroughly than any blow he had taken in 20 years of violence, more thoroughly than anything he had ever prepared himself to survive. Signed statements. Financial records, decades old, meticulously preserved in careful protective sleeves. Photographs, grainy but unmistakable. A chain of evidence assembled with the kind of surgical, obsessive patience that could only have taken years to compile, proof, complete and irrefutable, that his own father had murdered her family in cold blood 3 decades earlier, in order to seize the very syndicate throne that Alessandro now sat upon without ever once questioning how it had come to be his in the first place. The photographs were the worst of it. He made himself look at each one regardless, some grim, self-punishing instinct refusing to let him look away, the way a man might force himself to hold a hand over an open flame simply to confirm that it burned exactly as much as he'd been told. A house he recognized from old family stories, windows dark, a single car parked askew in the drive. A ledger page, his father's handwriting unmistakable even 30 years younger, listing names beside amounts that had nothing to do with money. A newspaper clipping, yellowed and brief, reporting a fire that investigators at the time had ruled accidental, 4 paragraphs total, buried on page 11 of a paper that no longer existed. He read it twice. Both times, the word accidental seemed to grow louder on the page, until it no longer looked like a word at all, only an insult. They called it a gas leak, Elena said quietly, watching him read it. It took me 3 years to find the fire inspector who actually responded that night. He's 81 now. He still remembers the smell, he told me, because it wasn't gas at all. It doesn't take an expert to know the difference, apparently. It only takes someone willing to ask. He stumbled backward, his hip catching hard against the edge of the desk. His whiskey glass toppled and struck the floor, shattering in a bright, scattering crash of crystal that seemed to echo through the penthouse far longer than it reasonably should have, each fragment catching the low light for a moment before it settled into stillness. "You're lying," he said, though the words came out thin, unconvincing even to his own ears. "This is forged. All of it. It has to be." "Ask your Uncle Marco," Elena said. "He was 17 when it happened. He helped bury 3 of my relatives with his own hands, out past the old vineyard your family still owns. He'll deny it to your face, of course. Then ask him again in private, without your father's portrait watching him from the wall, and see what he actually says." Elena took a slow, deliberate step forward into the space he had vacated, closing the distance between them by exactly as much as he had lost his footing. When she spoke again, her voice no longer asked for anything at all. It commanded the room outright, resonant with a weight and an authority that felt inherited rather than performed, generations deep, older than either of them standing in that room. "You spent your whole life playing at being a boss," she said, each word measured, unhurried, final. "I spent 10 years actually becoming one. While you were pouring drinks and reciting numbers you never once bothered to verify, I was quietly buying out every lieutenant you have. Every single one contract at a time, over years, in cities you never thought to look, through companies you never thought to trace back to a single name. They don't answer to you anymore, Alessandro. They haven't for months. You've been giving orders to men who report to me before they ever report to you, and have been for longer than you'd like to imagine." She let the silence hang a moment longer before continuing, watching him absorb the full shape of what he had just lost. 10 years, she said again, quieter now, almost to herself. "Do you have any idea what that actually looks like? I was 19 the night my mother told me the truth about our name, sitting in a kitchen in a city you've never heard of, in an apartment with water stains on the ceiling and a landlord who came around twice a month asking for money we didn't have. She told me everything, the founding charter, the blood oath, the night your father decided 100 years of partnership was worth less than 100% of something instead of 50. And then she made me promise not to do anything foolish with the knowledge, because foolish was exactly what had gotten everyone else in our family killed. You didn't keep that promise, Alessandro said. I kept it for 6 years, Elena said. I finished school. I took a job at a bank in Geneva that had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, and I was good at it, and for a while I told myself that was going to be enough, a quiet life, a new name, a door closed on all of it. And then one night I was reviewing a set of accounts that crossed my desk entirely by accident, shell companies nested inside shell companies, and I recognized one of the routing numbers. It belonged to your father. That was the night I stopped being foolish and started being patient instead, which turned out to be a great deal more dangerous. She began to walk, slow and unhurried, tracing a loose circle around the wreckage of his desk, and he found himself turning to follow her with his eyes, unable to look away even now. I spent the first 2 years just learning the shape of your organization from the outside, she continued. Who reported to whom? Which lieutenants resented you and which ones feared you and which few actually loved you, because those, I learned quickly, are the only kind worth being careful with. I spent the next 4 years buying, quietly, patiently, never more than one relationship at a time, never anything large enough to trip an alarm. A shipping contract here. A debt forgiven there, at exactly the moment a man needed it forgiven most. A favor extended to a lieutenant's brother facing charges in another jurisdiction. None of it looked like anything, taken individually. Together, it was an army you never once saw being assembled around you. And the last 4 years, he said quietly. The last 4 years, she said, were spent building the fiction that brought me through your front door tonight. A family. A debt. A daughter desperate enough to be delivered to you wrapped in exactly the paper you'd expect. I needed you certain, Alessandro. Not suspicious. Not cautious. Certain. A man planning to conquer something rarely bothers double-checking a woman he believes has already been conquered. He absorbed that in silence, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the last of its earlier command entirely. You could have simply told me, he said. 10 years ago. Before any of this. We could have. Could have what, she said, something sharper cutting briefly through her composure for the first time all evening. Split it evenly, the way our families were always meant to. You were 17 when your father filled a grave with people who share my blood, Alessandro. Do you imagine, for even a moment, that a conversation would have accomplished what tonight accomplished? He had no answer for that. She hadn't expected one. The metallic click of a hammer being drawn back cut sharply through the room. Alessandro's arm came up on instinct, the weapon leveled squarely at her chest, his breathing ragged and uneven now, the desperate motion of a man grasping for the one lever of control he still believed remained within his reach, the only card he had left to play. Then maybe I remove the problem right here, he said, though his voice betrayed him, thin and unsteady in a way his voice had never once been in his adult life. No envelope, no lieutenants, no dead man switch matters if you're not breathing to trigger it. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't so much as glance at the barrel pointed at her chest. Instead, with a composure that seemed to make the gun itself look small and unimportant in the vastness of the room, she lifted her wrist and tapped, once, against the face of a slim black smartwatch strapped there. That's a dead man's switch, she said, her tone as calm and unhurried as if she were reading him a grocery list rather than the terms of his own destruction. If my heart stops beating, from that gun, or from anything else that happens to me tonight, or tomorrow, or next year, every document in that envelope, along with several thousand pages I haven't shown you yet, goes straight to the commission within the hour. Not the police. Not the press. The commission itself, along with every family who ever trusted your father's account of what happened 30 years ago. You will not survive until dawn if that happens. You'll be fortunate if you survive until midnight, once they understand what your father did and what it means for every man who has spent 30 years benefiting from his silence. You're bluffing, Alessandro said, though the gun in his hand had already begun, almost imperceptibly, to lower. Am I? Elena said. Think carefully before you decide how much you're willing to wager on that answer. I've had 10 years to consider every possible way tonight might end, including this one. I promise you, this is not the outcome I'm least prepared for. You could be lying about the watch. About all of it. A dead man's switch is easy to claim and considerably harder to prove standing in a room with no one else left to witness it. You're right, she said, unbothered. You could shoot me right now and discover, in the next 60 seconds, whether I was telling the truth. Some men in your position would take that gamble. I studied you long enough to know you're not one of them. You didn't survive 20 years running this organization by making decisions you couldn't verify first. That caution is the only reason you're still alive to be having this conversation with me at all. Test me, Elena said simply. I've been waiting 10 years for the opportunity. I promise you, I won't mind if you make me use it early. The silence that followed stretched long and agonizing, pulled taut across the room like a wire on the verge of snapping under its own tension. Slowly, degree by degree, his arm continued to lower until it hung uselessly at his side. His breathing evened out at last, though not from any calm settling over him. It was the flat, hollow stillness of total defeat, the particular quiet of a man who has finally understood there is nothing left to fight for. The gun slipped from his fingers and struck the surface of the desk with a heavy, hollow clatter, a sound as final and complete as any surrender he had ever witnessed another man make, now made by his own hand, in his own home. Elena stood over him now, and there was no mistaking, not for a single second, who held command of the room. Here are your terms, she said, and she said it the way one might read aloud the conditions of a contract already signed, already notarized, already beyond negotiation. You remain the boss in public. You take the meetings. You shake the hands. You stand in the front of every photograph and absorb every ounce of scrutiny that comes our way, because a syndicate needs a recognizable face, and yours, for now, will do well enough. But you work for me now. Every decision, every dollar, every order that moves through this organization runs through me first, and only afterward, if it's necessary at all, through you. You'll need me to believe you can actually run it, he said, some last, threadbare scrap of pride surfacing despite everything. An organization like this doesn't answer to a name on a piece of paper. It answers to whoever the men in the room believe can protect them and profit them in equal measure. That takes more than a decade of quiet planning. It takes years of proving it, in rooms exactly like this one, over and over, until no one thinks to question it anymore. I'm aware, Elena said. Which is precisely why you're going to help me prove it, starting tomorrow morning. Consider it the first order I've given you. It won't be the last, and I'd advise you to grow accustomed to how it feels, because you'll be hearing it for a very long time. And if the men in that room decide they'd rather not answer to either of us, he said. What then? Then we'll discover, together, exactly how thorough my planning has actually been, she said. I'd encourage you to hope, for both our sakes, that it's thorough enough. I have every intention of finding out either way, with or without your help. It will simply go easier for you if you decide, tonight, to offer it. And if I refuse, he said, though there was no real defiance left in it, only the hollow reflex of asking. Then the envelope goes out tonight instead of staying exactly where it is, she said. And you spend whatever time you have left explaining to the commission why your father's name belongs on it. I don't think that conversation ends particularly well for you. I don't think you think so either. He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the ruin of paper scattered across his own desk, at the shards of crystal still glittering faintly near his feet. Why not simply take it, he said finally. All of it. You have the lieutenants. You have the proof. You could have had me removed from this room an hour ago and never once had to look at my face while you did it. Why the envelope? Why the theater? Something almost like respect passed briefly across her expression, there and gone before he could be certain he hadn't imagined it. Because removing you quietly would have made me exactly what your father was 30 years ago, she said. A thief who took a throne in the dark and hoped no one would ask how. I want every man in this organization to watch you hand it to me. I want them to understand precisely why you did, so that no one ever mistakes what happens next for a coup instead of what it actually is, a correction, 30 years overdue. And my father, Alessandro said quietly. What happens to him? That, Elena said, is the one decision I haven't finished making yet. Pray I finish making it in a mood you prefer. He said nothing. There was, he understood now, nothing left worth saying. She leaned in close then, close enough that her next words landed against his ear like a blade slipped quietly and precisely between the ribs, a soft, venomous echo of everything he had said to her less than an hour earlier, thrown back at him now with interest of its own, collected in full. You're mine tonight, she whispered. And every night that comes after it. Then she turned away from him, unhurried, and crossed the room toward the private elevator set discreetly into the far wall. She pressed the call button, and the doors slid open at once with a soft, pleasant chime, spilling warm golden light out across the wreckage of his penthouse floor, across the shattered crystal still glittering near the desk, across the man standing motionless amid the ruins of everything he had believed about himself an hour earlier. She paused there for a moment, framed perfectly in the doorway, and looked back at him one final time, unhurried, entirely in control, entirely certain of everything that would follow. If you want to survive the night, she said, you belong to me now. The doors slid shut behind her with a quiet, final ding, sealing her away and leaving Alessandro alone amid shattered glass and the last fading notes of jazz still murmuring faithfully from the hidden speakers, unaware or indifferent to everything that had just changed within the room, alone, for the first time in his life, in the wreckage of an empire he had never once thought to doubt was entirely his own, and would never again be able to claim without her permission. He stood there for a long while after the elevator's chime had faded entirely, listening to the storm still battering the windows, to the low murmur of brass and piano that had witnessed the whole of his undoing without once changing tempo. He thought, absurdly, of turning the music off, and then found he lacked the will to cross the room and do it. Instead he lowered himself slowly into the chair behind his desk, the same chair his father had once occupied, the same desk his father had once used to sign away, with a single quiet order 30 years ago, the lives of an entire family he had called partners. He understood now, with a clarity that felt almost violent in its suddenness, that he had spent his whole life sitting in a dead man's chair, believing it had always been his by right. Somewhere below, in the quiet, rain-slicked streets, a car waited for Elena at the curb, engine idling, headlights cutting twin gold lines through the downpour. She stepped into the back seat without a word to the driver, who already knew where to take her, and allowed herself, finally, to exhale, a long, slow breath she had been holding, in one form or another, for the better part of 10 years. The performance was over. What remained now was simply the truth, which she found, to her mild surprise, was heavier to carry than the lie had ever been. She did not feel triumphant, not exactly, though she had expected to. She felt, instead, something closer to exhaustion, the particular fatigue of a woman who has spent a decade building toward a single night and has now, finally, arrived on the other side of it with nothing left to plan for. She thought of her mother, of the kitchen with the water-stained ceiling, of a promise she had broken so thoroughly and so patiently that breaking it no longer felt like betrayal at all, only inheritance. She thought, too, unwillingly, of the look on Alessandro's face in the instant before the floor went out from under him, not fear, exactly, but something close to it, something she suspected she would remember for a long time, whether she wanted to or not. Upstairs, Alessandro remained where he had settled, staring at the wreckage of paper and crystal scattered across the desk that would, from tonight forward, answer to a name other than his own. Outside, the storm showed no sign of relenting. He found, oddly, that he no longer minded it. There was a strange, unfamiliar relief in finally being made to answer to something larger than his own certainty, even if that something now wore the shape of a woman who had walked calmly into his home wearing fear like a borrowed coat, and left wearing nothing but the truth. He picked up the century-old blood oath from among the scattered pages, holding it carefully, as though it might yet dissolve in his hands. Two founding houses, it read, in ink faded but legible, undivided and equal, so long as both endure. He read the line 3 times before setting the page down again, and for the first time since the doors had closed behind 2 guards who no longer worked for him, Don Alessandro Rossi allowed himself to consider, seriously, what it might mean to endure the rest of his life on someone else's terms, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that some small, unfamiliar part of him was not entirely opposed to finding out. Below, in the back seat of the idling car, Elena finally allowed herself to close her eyes as the city slid past the rain-streaked window, gold light smearing into long, liquid ribbons against the glass. 10 years of patience had narrowed, in the space of a single hour, into something far more immediate and far less certain than any plan could account for, the actual, ongoing work of holding an empire together with a man who had every reason in the world to resent her for taking it, and, if she allowed herself to be honest in the privacy of the back seat with no one watching, a man she had not expected, after everything, to find remotely difficult to keep looking at. She pushed the thought away as soon as it arrived, filing it beside every other inconvenient feeling she had spent a decade learning to set aside in service of something larger. There would be time enough later to decide what, if anything, to do with it. Tonight had only ever been the opening move. Upstairs, the storm continued to beat against the glass, indifferent to everything that had changed within the room it surrounded. The jazz played on, unbothered, the same unhurried brass and piano that had witnessed the entire unraveling of a life Alessandro had spent 30 years believing was unassailable. He remained in the chair a long while longer, listening to it, turning the blood oath over once more in his hands, and when he finally rose to gather the scattered pages from his desk and return them, carefully, to their envelope, it was with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who understood, at last, that some debts could never truly be settled, only inherited, carried forward, and, if he was fortunate, eventually shared.